Is a person who has had a profound awakening essentially the same as a functional psychopath? What are the differences and similarities between what's called awakening and the so called wisdom of psychopaths? This is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. I recently reread a book I read back in 2013 when it first came out called The Wisdom of Psychopaths by the psychologist Kegan. It's a really interesting book. I recommend reading it. And Kegan kind of proposes this, and he's not the only one, or at least he proposes that there are strong similarities between spiritually realized folks, so to speak, and people with relatively high psychopathic tendencies. He posits this model where he talks about, on the one side, you have so called spiritual qualities such as love, compassion, unity, truthfulness. On the other side, you have behavioral manifestations of psychopathy, such as pathological lying, being cunning and exploitative, being highly narcissistic and entitled. But he talks about in between the two, you have these commonly shared traits or capacities, such as stoicism, non attachment, focus, fearlessness, ruthlessness. Kegan makes the point that functional psychopathy, these capacities dialed in at the right sequence in the right context, can be very adaptive. He talks about CEOs, lawyers, surgeons, politicians, special operations soldiers, that these professions are full of people with high psychopathic traits, and that these people often do better. So, is he right? Does spiritual awakening pretty much equate with being a functional psychopath? Well, let's have an in-depth look at this, and let's start with some definitions. So, what is meant by awakening? Well, let me try to offer some descriptions of this. So, when people talk about awakening, you're awakening from something. Now, for most people, there's a lot of self referential thinking going on, and there's this automatic identification with these self referential thoughts and feelings. And this makes it seem as if what we are is essentially this voice of the mind. And it's then very easy to get quite neurotic because if we have painful thoughts, these thoughts seem to essentially be who we are or say something deeply personal about us. You know, for most of us, there's this sense that, okay, I am now, but I'm moving through time. There's this separate, permanent sense of self that has a past and is now and is moving into the future, and which is separated from other people and the world, usually in here behind the eyes. That's kind of the typical operating system. So, what happens when people have awakenings is that there's this realization that they're not who they think they are. There's this realization that they're not these thoughts or these feelings, that they're not the voice of the mind. Often there's an identification then with the consciousness or awareness which is aware of these self referential thoughts and feelings. So instead of it seeming as if we are a separate self, the self is seen as a process, as an activity, a verb instead of a noun, and it no longer looks like who we are. It's more or less seen as just another process. The Buddha used to say something alongside, in the seeing there's just the seeing, in the cognition there's just the cognizing, in the feeling there's just the feeling. Meaning, for most of us, it seems as if there's this self or I that's doing the thinking, that's doing the deciding, that's doing the choosing, that's the doer essentially. And the kind of hallmark of awakening is to realize that there is no such thing. There is no doer, there is no thinker, there is no feeler, there is no seer. There's just this emerging. The meditation teacher Trungpa was once asked what enlightenment was like, and he said it's a bit as if the blue sky turned into a pancake and fell on your head. So that where your head used to be, there's just the world. The feeling of me and the clear blue sky is the exact same. So there's this realization that what we are is essentially just the flow of life itself and the very ground of being or consciousness that everything arises out of. There's no separate self from that. That's the hallmark of awakening. Now, there was another Zen master who once said, when the bell rung, there was the realization that there was no I, there was no bell, there was just ringing itself as itself. So, what is psychopathy? Well, psychopathy is a personality construct. It seems to be a combination of certain traits. So, what you're looking at is callousness, a kind of cold hearted, callous temperament. You're looking at a kind of fearless, dominant personality style, and you're looking at someone who's kind of disinhibited. So if you have someone who's very callous, who's fearless and dominant and disinhibited, you could say that this person probably has strong psychopathic tendencies. Also, there's a lack of the kind of pro-social emotions, such as having a conscience, having empathy, feeling love, bonding, feeling loyalty, shared intimacy. Um, these sorts of things tend not to be there. Now, of course, just as with awakening, it's like on a continuum, So you have some people like Nisargadatta Maharaj or Byron Katie, who've had these like profound awakenings, and it just seems to blow out their pre-existing operating system. And then you have others who have, glimpses or parts of it. And it may or may not change their personality tendencies or how they operate in the world significantly. So it's on a continuum. And the same goes with psychopathy. We probably all have some of that stuff going on. And then you have people who have a lot of that stuff going on. So we can talk about people with high psychopathic traits. Now, one kind of background that I have in doing this, of course, I've spent the last 27 years seeing clients professionally. I teach something called the psychological illusion model, which largely is about helping people to realize the illusory nature of thought and self. So I make my living helping people have these sorts of insights as relevant to them. And since I first read that book, The Wisdom of Psychopaths, back in 2013, I have had a chance to have quite a few in-depth conversations with members of the prison population. Many of these qualify for antisocial personality disorder. Now, uh, antisocial personality disorder is not the same as psychopathy. It's kind of like the behavioral tendency. Psychopathy is more of a personality style. So you could say that, probably 30% or so of the people who qualify for antisocial personality disorder, you could probably call psychopaths. But I've had quite a few conversations with people who have these traits. Now, is Kevin Dutton right? Well, I think he's onto something, but I think he's mostly wrong. And I'll tell you why. So let's start with the whole sense of self. One thing that's really interesting to look at, if you look at the so-called cluster B personality tendencies, is that there's the lack of a psychological sense of self. Of course, there's a sense of self, but it's not really a psychologically minded uh, sense of self. Whether that is the people with dissocial personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy or narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, or histrionic personality disorder. You'll see a common denominator is that these people have never really developed an adult, stable, autonomous sense of self over time. Now, and they're not psychologically oriented. So if you speak to them, you'll realize that they have thoughts and feelings, but there's not a rich subjective inner life where they have feelings about their feelings and thoughts about their thoughts and internal reflections on what type of person they are as a result of doing these things. And as a result of that, they have shallow affect. They seem glib and superficial. They lack depth. Versus the people who have had spiritual awakenings are usually, not always, but usually quite psychologically minded. And many of them have developed a psychological sense of self, which they now see as illusory. So they're different from, let's say, the average Joe or the common person who has a sense of self and is highly identified with it. The psychopaths haven't really developed it to begin with, and the people who have had strong awakenings that last over time have kind of seen through it as illusory. So it's not quite the same thing. For those of you who are into developmental psychology and who have heard about Robert Kegan's model, I would make the claim that people with strong psychopathic tendencies are probably stuck at Kegan stage 2, what's often referred to as a self-sovereign form of mind. They're pre-socialized. They don't yet actually have the capacity for guilt, for empathy, for loyalty, for shared intimacy, for being part of something bigger than themselves. It's not that they've transcended these things. They haven't developed it yet. So I think that Kevin Dutton kind of romanticizes psychopaths, as do many others. I think it's a bit like taking someone who is blind and has no hands and giving them a lot of credit for not being a pickpocket. There's a difference between someone who's blind and having no hands not being a pickpocket versus someone who has their sight functional and who has hands and who's not a pickpocket. It's of course, if you're the owner of the wallet, it doesn't really make a difference, but there is a difference there. So what does Kegan stage 2 really entail? Well, let's use two words. We have the word subject, which refers to that which experiences something, and we have the term object, which refers to that which is experienced. So at different stages of psychological development, what is subject and what is object changes. So what you're subject to at one developmental stage becomes something you can take as object at the next developmental stage. So people at Kegan stage 2 are subject to their immediate needs, their kind of enduring interests and roles. So they're subject to that. They see everything through that. So they're highly egocentric. So you then, if I operate at Kegan stage 2 and I'm subject to my perceived needs and enduring interests and roles, you are then kind of a supplier to the self, meaning you're either someone who's useful, who can provide something for me, or you're kind of in the way. That's who you are. I don't really see you as a separate person with their own inner life and subjectivity because I haven't really developed that for myself yet. So relationships tend to be quite transactional. There's no real loyalty or depth or shared intimacy. It's just kind of tit for tat, right? Um, Now, if I operate here, then feelings like guilt, shame, empathy, conscience, loyalty, personal responsibility, they're not quite online yet. So for some people, it might seem as if these people are very independent and confident and yeah, in a way, they don't care about stuff like that. Not because they've transcended it or have perspective on it, but it's because they're pre-socialized. So if I operate from Kegan stage 2, I'm able to see that you have a different perspective than mine. I can kind of imagine what your perspective is. I can do that. But what I can't do is I can't take two perspectives simultaneously and experience them at the same time. So for me to be able to have a psychological sense of self over time, I need to be able to coordinate two perspectives and experience them simultaneously, meaning what I want now and what I want in the future, I need to be able to coordinate them and experience them at the same time so that a possible future becomes part of my present experience. Only now will I care about future consequences. Otherwise, I might know about it, but I don't really care because I don't have that sense of responsibility. For me to feel guilt or empathy, I have to internalize some social standard and kind of co-construct my sense of self based upon how well I'm living up to that standard. So a socialized mind then, which is the next stage in Kegan's system, is someone where they become part of society, or at least part of society, and part of society becomes part of them. They internalize certain social views and kind of co-create a sense of self out of it. And that might be a religion, for example. So if I internalize certain ideas from the religion, then I kind of co-construct my sense of self based upon how well I seem to be living in accordance with these internalized rules or norms. Or if I'm in a relationship with someone, then it's more a tendency of becoming the relationship. You know, how my significant other views me becomes a instrumental part of how I then view myself. So if I do or say something to hurt my partner, then the fact that she's hurt becomes a part of becomes a basis of how I experience myself, right? You got to be able to do this to experience empathy and guilt in a kind of socialized way, to have a conscience. Uh, People who operate from Kegan's stage two, they might say that they're guilty. You know, let's say they've had an affair. Cheated on their partner. They might say that they're, or they've done something wrong. They might say that they're guilty. But if you really talk to them about it, it's more of a worry. It's more like, what if she finds out and then she will no longer lend me money, or she'll no longer be a supplier to the self. It's more that versus shit. I love my wife, and I had this affair, and if she finds out, the fact that I could do that to her will devastate her, and I'll feel awful about myself as a result of she feeling awful. That sort of guilt is more a socialized type of guilt. It's this capacity that allows people to be loyal, to be socialized, to have shared intimacy, and to feel that they are part of something bigger than themselves. It's also the very same thing that allows them to be idealistic, and to have a new sense of subjectivity. So if you speak to people who are very psychopathic, you'll see that they have thoughts and feelings, but they have shallow affect. They're shallow. They don't have a rich inner life. They don't really self-reflect. They don't have thoughts about their thoughts or feelings about their feelings. The fact that I feel this way, what does that say about me as a person? And if you look at like someone being insecure or self-conscious, you have to reflect on, you have to have feelings about feelings and thoughts about thoughts and thoughts about feelings. That's a different form of subjectivity. The psychopath isn't worried or isn't ruminating about stuff like that because it's not online. So this is kind of different. It's a bit like when people in the three principles community, and I'm a fan of the three principles, by the way, but when people in the three principles community sometimes idolize children and say, oh, children are in the now, they don't worry, they don't depress, they don't ruminate. I say, yeah, but they haven't developed the capacity to construct a possible future and have it be part of their present experience yet. So there's a difference between that and someone who has that capacity but is able to have perspective on it. So I think that Kevin Dutton is, and others who make similar claims, are kind of doing what the integral philosopher Ken Wilber called the pre-trans fallacy, and that is that tendency to either take pre-rational states of mind and elevate them to kind of post-rational states of mind, or to take post-rational states of mind and to kind of reduce them to a kind of infantile narcissism or egocentrism. So their reason, rationality is about having perspective and coordinating perspectives. Post-rational states and pre-rational states are both kind of non-rational, but they're not the same. I'll give an example. The infant doesn't have a lot of distinctions because they don't have language. So they have no differentiations between the sensations of their own thumb and the carpet. There's a oneness in that. As children and people evolve, we develop language and we develop the capacity to create categories and sense of time and space and self and other, and these are useful, necessary distinctions to operate in the world. There's a difference between that and someone who has had the realization that these distinctions are thought created and that essentially it is all one or not two, right? They're both kind of non-rational in a sense, but it's not quite the same. So if we look at psychopaths and a relative fearlessness, that seems to be one of the hallmarks of psychopathy is very low neuroticism, very low levels of fear. Now, there might be neurobiological factors at play there as well. That's not really my forte, you know. Um, but and some people also say that it's not just that, but it's that they're so enticed by reward that they don't really notice threats, right? But in any respect, if you look at people who have a lot of neuroticism going on, there's usually a lot of worry and a lot of rumination, which is why you have the expression that rumination is depression's best friend and worry is anxiety's best friend. Thoughts about a past and a future and the self that this all revolves around, you know. A lot of people have a lot of issues with this. The person who's had an awakening, you know, depending upon the depth of that awakening and how well it has matured and contextualized, has had the realization that the self that these thoughts and feelings refer to is an illusion. There's an increased capacity to see this as thought generated. And as a result of that, they will likely be less neurotic because the thoughts are seen as thoughts to a larger degree. The psychopath is less neurotic for other reasons. Might be neurobiological ones, but also because they're not really self reflecting and worrying and ruminating because they don't have the capacity to have a possible future feel as their present experience yet. They don't have a sense of self over time. They're not psychologically oriented. So they might both be less neurotic, but for very different reasons. If we look at sense of responsibility or blame, there's a prison psychiatrist by the name of Theodore Dalrymple, which is his pen name, obviously. He's written a lot of excellent books. He has this kind of autobiography called The Knife Went In. He talks about murderers in prison, and quite a few of these probably have some good psychopathic traits, even though most psychopaths are not violent or murderers per se. But he said that the most typical thing, but many of them are probably Kegan's level 2, stage 2, whether they're psychopathic or not, right? But he said that the most typical thing they would say is, and then the knife went in. There was never the acknowledgement that I stabbed the person or I did that. There's this externalization of blame. This you see with psychopaths, and this you also see with Kegan stage 2, also for those who are not psychopathic, right? There's this failure to accept any responsibility. They don't have that sense of personal responsibility yet. Now, the person who's had an awakening, if it's truly seen that there's no such thing as a self, then the flip side of that is no free will. Or more accurately, there is no one to have it. Meaning, if there's no thinker behind the thoughts, if there's no chooser behind the choices, if there's no decider behind the decisions, or a doer behind the actions, so to speak, then there's the realization that things could not have been any different. So as a result of that, to the extent that that is seen, regret, guilt, hate, these sorts of feelings tend to diminish or be eliminated. There's a more interconnected, there's more just life emerged that way. There's no self that's doing it, right? So this sounds kind of similar in a sense, that there's no stabber behind the stabbing, there's no thinker behind the thoughts, right? But it's not quite the same as Dalrymple's subjects of the knife went in. You will find with people who have had awakenings, especially if they're mature, that they live quite responsible lives quite often because they view responsibility as a social contract. By the way, in Kegan's system, beyond the socialized mind, there's something called a self-authoring mind, and that is more that capacity to step back from one's socialization and develop one's own take on things, more perspective on these things. And someone who operates here can offer more freedom to other people. They can allow other people to be themselves at a much higher rate because they've granted that sense of freedom for themselves. It's only here that people are able to truly see other people as people who have their own deep, rich inner subjectivity that is distinct from their own, and to be respectful of that. It's no longer threatening in the same way. And then after that, you have the self-transforming mind, which is when the self system, one's own interpersonal authority, is increasingly seen as object, taken as object, seen as a process. So if you have someone who has self-authoring or self-transforming capacities, there's more of a mature responsibility in the way one acts in the world, even though there's necessarily no sense of personal responsibility internally. So that's kind of paradoxical. Um, yeah, the ability to focus, sure. If you have less noise in the system, it's easier to be present. Some kind of commonalities sometimes. Lack of long-term goals. If you look at, one of the tendencies of psychopaths is they lack realistic long-term goals. They're kind of hedonistic and they live in the moment. What can happen sometimes when people have these awakenings is that, not always, this is quite different for different folks, but some of them might lose a lot of their motivation initially because so much of their goals, was about validation and approval and status, and this is all related to that self narrative, and when that's no longer identified with or no longer looks as real, then those things might seem less compelling. Um, other other things here to look at. Well, love. So I mean, the psychopath isn't really capable of love. Someone at Kegan's stage 2 who's not psychopathic might be a very lovable person. If they're high in agreeableness or um, but it's still very egocentric in a way. It's more the way that a teenager loves or a child loves. The psychopath doesn't really attach to other people, doesn't bond, so it's tit for tat. It's exploitative. Um, when people have these sorts of awakenings, and it's seen that, wait a minute, my my partner is not who I think they are, and I'm not who I think I am. Um, Sometimes there can be disruptions to marriages. It can be quite destabilizing, and attachments to other people might loosen. Even though there might still be this recognition that we share the same being. So, I mean, I've seen both things. I've seen relationships end, I've also seen them deepen as a result of this. It's very interesting. Gary Weber, who's a very well-known teacher of non-duality and who's been part of many neuroscience experiments, they discovered that in his brain, his default mode network was pretty much turned off, not only when meditating, but also when not meditating. and this corresponds with virtually no self-referential thoughts. One of the things that he claims happened once he had his big shift was that parental love completely disappeared. So there's this interview with Robert Wright, the author of Why Buddhism is True, where he asks Gary Weber about this, and he says, well, this was kind of one of the downsides to some extent, is that that parental love completely disappeared because you need to have a self to hold it. And he was asked, well, what if your daughters were in a car accident? What would you feel? And he said, no, it would be like watching on the news anyone else dying in a car accident. It wouldn't. But paradoxically, he says that he thinks, and his two adult daughters thinks, that he's a better parent because he's able to be completely present with them in the moment with no agenda of how they should be or how they need to be to please him. And that has improved things. This hasn't happened for me. I haven't had the extent of awakening that of a Gary Weber. There's still self-referential stuff going on here. So there's still an attachment to my wife. There's still an attachment to my kids. But I can see that how some people can end up in that place if self-referential thinking completely stops. Social situations or sex, talk about sex too. Psychopaths tend to be very promiscuous and have a lot of sexual partners and stuff like that. Having spoken to people who have had awakenings, some people report no changes in their sexuality. Some people report a dramatic reduction in it because there's the realization of how much of it is based upon approval and these sorts of things. But also you've had others where when the attachments to social and conventional norms may no longer be there, that they become way more sexual and way more experiential. So those things seem to be able to swing in different directions. In terms of relationships in general, it seems as if that when people have awakenings, that they are able to be kinder and gentler and more present. But sometimes people can come off also as more assholic in that they're not as attached. They're not necessarily as interested in people's stories anymore. And some people have reported challenges in relationships and social situations because so much of social interactions is about validation of one's own identity and approval and validation and status. And when that no longer appeals in the same way, there might be less of an interest in people's stories or validating or being validated. And that can come across as not caring or as coldness. Finally, let's talk about ruthlessness. So I mean, the psychopath, can be ruthless from a position of not caring. But if you watch someone like Byron Katie, who's clearly had a deep awakening, and you see the way she does the work, it seems to come from a kind of impersonal love, the recognition that she shares her being with this other person, but there's a ruthlessness, there's a tough love, there's and some people view that and go, she's a psychopath, or she lacks empathy, or but I think this is just a result of her completely seeing that these stories are made up and not what the other person truly is, right? So I remember once at the UK hypnosis convention once, I did a demonstration with a woman whose ex boyfriend had put a gun in her mouth 10 years earlier, and I helped her see the illusory nature of that. And someone in the audience protested and said, you have to be a psychopath to, to think that way. And because she went from being very traumatized to not being traumatized at all. And of course, what I helped her see was that the thought gun in my mouth is not the same as a gun in my mouth. You don't have to be alarmed by it. But stuff like that from a conventional mindset can certainly look ruthless and cold and unempathic. Um, a lot of the kind of empathy that people do too, is a way of living up to social conventions so that one can feel validated. But if that stuff is no longer there in the same way, one might be less motivated to act in those ways. A final common thing between psychopaths and people who have awakenings is that the psychopaths don't seem to emotionally code their memories that much. It just more looks like facts, or, this happened. When the kind of narrative mind or self referential thinking drops off a lot, that also results in people's memories being coded less emotionally. And sometimes people have trouble remembering events and things that are outside of their routine. So, anyways, I hope these ramblings were useful and interesting to you. Um, I'd love to hear what you think, whether you agree, partially agree, completely disagree. Drop it in the comments. If you'd like to make some changes in your life and you're curious to know if you and I could be a good fit, I invite you to contact me at provocativehypnosis.com. And if you're watching this in 2024, I'm coming to Australia in October to do a seminar. If you're interested in that regarding the psychological illusion model, hit the seminar page at provocativehypnosis.com. As always, thanks for listening.